What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that the United States and its allies had hoped would hold for at least another decade. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, resilience, and something that nobody in Moscow, Beijing, or even Washington expected. They revealed a hidden trump card that may have just changed everything. For months now, there had been signals, not formal declarations from the Kremlin, not public statements from state media, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been remarkably predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a logic, almost a doctrine that Western analysts had come to understand intimately over 30 years of post-Soviet observation. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian strategic behavior know the indicators, the diplomatic cables between Moscow and Beijing. The military repositioning along contested borders, the economic agreements signed behind closed doors, the sudden coordinated silence across multiple capitals that normally cannot stop talking. All of that went quiet 3 weeks ago. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. The silence wasn't just unusual, it was orchestrated, coordinated, intentional. Sources within European intelligence services described it as the calm before a geopolitical earthquake. They weren't wrong. What happened next would force the Pentagon to issue what insiders are now calling one of the most significant strategic reassessments since the Cold War ended. Early Tuesday morning, Western intelligence services detected what they described as unprecedented coordination between Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, including military logistics agreements and joint command structures that had not been activated in over a decade. These are the kinds of arrangements that Russia only formalizes when they are signaling something very specific, preparation for a major offensive, long-term strategic realignment, or a direct challenge to Western hegemony. Pentagon planners didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing Russia's global posture in ways that hadn't been seen since the early months of the Ukraine invasion. And when a nuclear superpower shifts its strategic posture without explanation, even by a single degree, everyone pays attention. The intelligence that emerged painted a picture that alarmed officials at the highest levels. This wasn't just saber-rattling. This wasn't just diplomatic posturing. This was structural change. Russia, China, and Iran had formalized what analysts are now calling the axis of resistance, a military and economic partnership designed specifically to counter American influence and support Moscow's war in Ukraine indefinitely. Joint military exercises were scheduled, weapons transfers were accelerated, and most concerning of all, intelligence suggested that this alliance had agreed to a mutual defense clause that would trigger a collective response if any member faced direct Western intervention. The Pentagon's worst-case scenario had just become reality. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Briefing after briefing described Putin's move as destabilizing, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible in any near-term diplomatic framework. But intimidation through alliance building only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most strategically sophisticated we've seen in over 3 years of this conflict. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of the alliance formalization becoming public, Ukraine launched a coordinated operation that stunned military observers worldwide. These weren't the defensive operations we've become accustomed to seeing. These were precision offensive strikes, systems and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation. Military analysts in London described it as a masterclass in asymmetric response. Officials in Washington called it exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. But what exactly did Ukraine do? The answer lies in what intelligence sources are now calling Ukraine's hidden trump card, a capability that had been developed in secret with limited Western knowledge and deployed at the precise moment it would have maximum strategic impact. Tonight, Ukrainian defense officials confirmed that Kyiv launched coordinated deep strike operations on Russian logistics networks, including supply depots in occupied Crimea that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a major spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate the new alliance's military benefits. They hit ammunition storage facilities, they hit fuel depots critical to armored operations. They hit communication hubs that were likely preparing to coordinate with newly arrived Iranian drone operators. In other words, Ukraine targeted the connective tissue of Putin's war machine, the infrastructure that would have made the new alliance operationally meaningful. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Putin's alliance wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could prolong this war indefinitely if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike population centers, they didn't target political infrastructure, they hit military logistics with surgical precision, they hit the weak points in Russia's extended supply lines, and they did it using capabilities that Russia clearly did not anticipate. The hidden trump card, according to sources familiar with the operation, was a new generation of domestically produced long-range strike drones, developed in partnership with undisclosed Western allies and manufactured entirely within Ukrainian borders. These weren't the modified commercial drones that have defined so much of this conflict. These were purpose-built military systems with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers and guidance systems capable of evading Russian air defenses. Ukraine had been developing them in secret for over 18 months, and this week they revealed them to the world. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Pentagon analysts now believe that Putin's alliance formation was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and Brussels. Putin wanted to see whether NATO would fracture under the weight of a formalized adversarial bloc, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for Western guidance. They launched a response that was so immediate, so precisely targeted, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Vladimir Putin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with multiple outlets under anonymity described Putin's alliance announcement as strategic theater, a way to intimidate Western capitals into reducing support for Kyiv. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only militarily effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian commanders had no opportunity to relocate critical assets. That timing matters because it shows something crucial about Ukrainian intelligence capabilities. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian moves, they are anticipating them. They are inside the Kremlin's decision cycle. And that reality, more than any single weapon system, is what appears to have rattled Moscow most profoundly. Sources close to Russian military leadership describe genuine surprise at the scope and precision of Ukrainian operations. One source described the mood in the Russian Defense Ministry as concerned silence. When Russia goes silent twice in the same month, something fundamental has shifted. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learn more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out over 40 coordinated strikes, forcing Russian air defenses to deplete critical missile stockpiles. Special Operations Forces targeted radar installations that had been upgraded in the last 90 days with Chinese-supplied components. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly disabled 2 Russian vessels used by Moscow to enforce the grain corridor blockade. This wasn't just tactical success. This wasn't just operational achievement. This was strategic messaging. This was psychological warfare at the highest level. And psychological warfare is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failures of their initial invasion. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines Russian narrative control both domestically and internationally. The Kremlin can announce alliances with Beijing and Tehran, but when Ukrainian drones are striking targets deep inside Russian-controlled territory the very same week, the message of Russian strength rings hollow, and that narrative damage may ultimately matter more than any territorial gains. Remember, Putin thought that Western support would collapse after the first winter. They thought that European unity would fracture over energy costs. They thought that American political divisions would paralyze military aid indefinitely. They thought that time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western military aid is accelerating rather than slowing. Ukrainian domestic production capabilities are expanding rather than contracting. And the alliance that Putin announced this week is already facing its first major credibility test, one it appears to be failing. The Pentagon's acknowledgement of strategic setback is significant, not because it signals American weakness, but because it signals American realism. For the first time in months, senior defense officials are publicly stating that the old approaches may not be sufficient, that the conflict has entered a new phase requiring new thinking, and that Ukraine, despite being outmanned and outgunned on paper, continues to demonstrate capabilities that defy conventional military analysis. What makes this moment so critical and so unpredictable is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive action, faster territorial gains. Economic reformers want de-escalation before sanctions cause permanent structural damage. Regional governors want stability that allows basic governance to function, and the Russian public wants clarity about when this special military operation will finally end. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing an alliance with partners whose interests don't perfectly align with his own. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The alliance with China and Iran may look formidable on paper, but alliances forged under desperation rarely prove as durable as those built from genuine strategic alignment. China has its own interests in this conflict, interests that don't necessarily include Russian victory. Iran has its own vulnerabilities that Western pressure could exploit. And Russia itself is stretched thinner than at any point since the Soviet collapse. The Pentagon statement, now circulating through every major international news outlet, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow this new alliance to operate without consequence. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's formalization of military cooperation with adversarial states was inconsistent with international stability and the rules-based order. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and there will be a response. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake, and tonight something very serious is at stake. The statement went further than previous warnings, explicitly mentioning that the United States and its allies were reviewing all options for supporting Ukraine's defensive capabilities. That phrase, all options, carries weight in diplomatic circles. It suggests that capabilities previously withheld may now be under active consideration. It suggests that red lines previously maintained may be shifting, and it suggests that Washington recognizes this moment as an inflection point requiring decisive action. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation and the world in a measured, determined speech tonight. He said, "They build alliances of aggression, we build alliances of survival." He said, "Every new threat they announce, we answer not with fear but with action, And he said, Ukraine has capabilities that our enemies do not yet understand. Today they learned a small portion of what we can do. Tomorrow, if necessary, they will learn more. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's tone was notably confident, more confident than in recent addresses, and that confidence appears to be grounded in the success of this week's operations and the capabilities that remain undisclosed. The hidden trump card, it seems, was not a single weapon system. It was an entire strategic posture that Ukraine had developed in silence. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's alliance announcement wasn't isolated. Along with the formal defense agreements, China announced expanded economic cooperation that would help Russia circumvent Western sanctions. Iran confirmed acceleration of drone and missile technology transfers. North Korea increased ammunition shipments targeting Ukrainian defensive positions. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This appears to be a coordinated pressure campaign designed to overwhelm Western decision-making capacity. The goal is not necessarily military victory. The goal is strategic exhaustion. Putin believes that if he can present the West with enough simultaneous challenges, support for Ukraine will eventually collapse under the weight of competing priorities. But today's response from Kyiv suggests that strategy may be fundamentally flawed. Defense analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Putin is preparing a major spring offensive designed to capitalize on the new alliance's military support. Another is that Russia is attempting to create negotiating leverage before any potential diplomatic process. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish a permanent partition of Ukraine through attritional warfare supported by allied resources. Today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Western approval. They didn't defer to diplomatic timelines. They didn't allow Russia to set the tempo of this conflict. They seized the initiative with strikes that demonstrated both capability and will. And in doing so, they sent a message that transcends any single military operation. Ukraine will not be exhausted into surrender. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see if the West will tire before Russia breaks. Ukraine wants to show that their resolve only strengthens with each new threat. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from expanding into a broader confrontation, and China wants to prevent a Russian collapse that would undermine its own strategic position. Every actor in this drama has different objectives, but they all share one common understanding. What happens in the next 90 days will likely determine the trajectory of this conflict for years to come. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command communications for signs of response. They say that Russian military leadership is conducting emergency assessments of defensive vulnerabilities exposed by Ukrainian strikes. They say that diplomatic channels between Moscow and Beijing have shown unusual activity in the past 12 hours. And they say Putin's decision to formalize this alliance is likely part of a broader strategy intended to project strength while buying time for military recovery. But Ukraine is not allowing that recovery to proceed unchallenged. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating pressure at precisely the moment Russia expected relief. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Putin that intimidation will be met with action. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine remains a partner worth supporting. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this alliance announcement and what Ukraine's hidden capabilities truly include. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian planning cycles before they could adapt. It demonstrated capabilities that changed the battlefield calculus. And it showed the world that Ukraine remains unbowed after 3 years of brutal conflict. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 30 days. If Russia retreats to consolidate, this moment will be remembered as a turning point in the conflict. If Russia escalates further, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to match every escalation with capability. They have shown they are ready to fight for as long as it takes. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely uncertain about its next move. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is recalculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but never quite this clearly. Alliances on paper do not win wars. Intimidation only works against those who can be intimidated. And Ukraine, outmanned, outgunned, and outspent, refuses to be defeated. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The Pentagon's admission of strategic challenge is not a sign of defeat. It's a sign of honesty. Ukraine's hidden trump card has changed the equation in ways that Moscow did not anticipate. And the alliance that Putin announced this week may prove to be far more fragile than it appears. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds.